The first time I realized my neighbor had built a garage that opened directly into my driveway, I honestly thought I was looking at it wrong. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds, groceries still in my hands, staring at this half-finished structure like it was some kind of optical illusion. Then it hit me. If a truck ever came out of that garage, it wouldn't come out onto his property. It would come out onto mine. My name is Ryan Mercer, and up until that point, I'd spent almost 14 years living in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, Pennsylvania. The kind of place where people waved when they drove by, where kids rode bicycles after dinner, where the biggest neighborhood drama usually involves somebody forgetting to bring their trash cans back in. Then my neighbor, a guy named Travis Boone, decided he wanted a bigger garage. At first, nobody paid much attention. His old shed got demolished. Contractors arrived. Concrete trucks rolled in. Lumber appeared. Every morning on my way to work, I'd notice another piece of progress. Foundation 1 week. Framing the next. Roof shortly after. Completely normal. Or at least that's what I thought. One afternoon, I pulled into my driveway after work and noticed something strange. The large framed opening for the garage door wasn't facing the street. It wasn't facing his backyard either. It was angled toward my driveway. I remember actually laughing to myself. Not because it was funny, because my brain refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe there was another wall going up later. Maybe construction just looked weird halfway through. But over the next several days, the opening stayed exactly where it was. Then the garage door tracks went in. Then the support beams. Then more framing. And suddenly there was no denying it anymore. That garage was designed to use my driveway. I walked around my property line that evening trying to figure out how anybody thought this would work. The more I looked, the less sense it made. There wasn't enough room on Travis's side to line up a pickup truck. An SUV couldn't make the angle either. The only practical route was the strip of pavement that belonged to me. I stood there scratching my head. Who spends tens of thousands of dollars building a garage before figuring out how they're supposed to get into it? A few days later, I caught one of the contractors loading equipment into a trailer. I åkte over Kashuli. Hey, quick question, I said. That garage door really opening this direction? The guy glanced over his shoulder. Far as I know. I pointed toward my driveway. You realize that's my property, right? The contractor looked genuinely confused. For a second, he just stared at me. Then he shrugged. Owner said it was shared access. Shared access. I almost choked. Now here's something you should know about me. When my wife and I bought our house years earlier, I became that guy. The guy who reads every page, every survey, every county map, every line buried in paperwork that nobody else wants to look at. I spent an entire weekend studying those documents because I wanted to know exactly what we were buying. And I remembered one thing very clearly. My driveway sat entirely inside my property boundary. No easement, no shared use agreement, no access rights, nothing. So hearing a stranger confidently explain that my driveway was shared felt a little like having somebody explain my own birthday to me. That night after dinner, while my wife Emily watched television in the living room, I dug through an old filing cabinet in the basement. Property surveys, closing documents, county records, the whole stack. I spread everything across the kitchen table and started checking measurements. 10 minutes later, I found exactly what I expected. The property line ran only a couple feet from Travis's new garage wall. A couple feet. That was it. Meaning the garage door was aimed directly at land he had absolutely no legal right to use. And that's when my confusion turned into curiosity. Because suddenly I wasn't asking why Travis built the garage. I was asking something much bigger. How in the world had this project been approved in the first place? The next morning, I took photographs from every angle I could think of. Then I scanned my survey documents, attached everything to a short email, and sent it to the city building department. No acquiescents, no complaints, no angry. Just one simple question. Was this garage approved with vehicle access through my property? I hit send, closed my laptop, and figured maybe I'd hear something back a few weeks later. What I didn't know was that within 48 hours, a city inspector would pull up to Travis's house and turn his dream garage into the beginning of a very expensive nightmare. When I pulled into my driveway 2 days later and saw a city inspection truck parked in front of Travis Boone's house, I had a feeling things were about to get interesting. What I didn't realize was just how quickly the whole situation was about to unravel. The inspector was standing beside the new garage holding a clipboard, studying the structure with the kind of expression that never means good news. Travis stood nearby with his arms crossed, trying very hard to look relaxed. He wasn't relaxed. You could tell. The inspector walked around the building 3 separate times. He measured distances. He checked documents. He took photographs. Then he measured everything again. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was arguing. Somehow that made it even more uncomfortable. I parked my truck and pretended to organize tools in my garage while quietly watching from across the driveway. About 20 minutes later, I heard part of the conversation. The inspector pointed toward the garage opening. "That's not what's shown on the approved plans." Travis immediately answered, "It functions the same." The inspector shook his head. "No, sir, it doesn't." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to hear, even from 30 feet away. A few minutes later, the inspector packed up his paperwork and left. Travis disappeared into his house. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and nearly laughed. Bright red notice, right on the garage framing. "Stop work order." Big letters. Impossible to miss. It looked like someone had attached a giant warning label directly onto several months of construction. The reaction from the contractors was almost entertaining. One truck arrived. The crew got out, saw the notice, made a phone call, got back in the truck, left. Then another crew arrived. Same thing. By lunchtime, the entire site looked abandoned. No compresors, no navegants, no workers. Just a half-finished garage sitting there in complete silence. That evening, Emily looked out our kitchen window and shook her head. "He's got to be furious." I took a sip of coffee. "Probably. You feel bad." I thought about it. Honestly, I did. A little. Not because of Travis. Because construction isn't cheap. Mistakes aren't cheap. And somewhere along the way, somebody was about to lose a lot of money. A few days later, the inspector returned. This time I happened to be trimming hedges near the front yard when he arrived. After talking with Travis for nearly half an hour, he eventually walked over to introduce himself. He thanked me for sending the survey documents. Then he explained what happened. The approved permit package showed a completely different garage orientation. According to the plans submitted to the city, the garage entrance was supposed to face inward toward Travis's own property, not toward mine. Somewhere between approval and construction, the design changed. Whether it happened during planning, during revisions, or during actual construction wasn't clear yet. But the structure standing there no longer matched what had been approved. That alone was enough to stop the project. Then the inspector dropped the second problem. The bigger problem. Access. A garage isn't just a building, he explained. It has to be usable within the legal boundaries of the property. I nodded. Makes sense. He continued. If somebody has to drive across another private parcel to use it, that creates a legal conflict. What if the neighbor doesn't mind? I asked. He smiled. Today, maybe. What about 20 years from now? That answer stuck with me. Because he was right. Property changes. People move. Houses get sold. Relationships change. A structure can't depend on a handshake agreement that might disappear next year. The city couldn't approve a permanent dispute. For the next couple weeks, things got awkward. Really awkward. Travis stopped waving. Stopped saying hello. If we happened to walk outside at the same time, he'd suddenly become fascinated by something happening in the opposite direction. One evening, I was checking the mail when I heard his voice. "Ryan." I turned around. There he was, walking across the lawn, hands in pockets, trying very hard to look friendly. "Got a minute?" I already knew exactly where this conversation was headed. We stood beside the mailbox while he explained there had been confusion, miscommunication, changes during construction, different contractors saying different things. A lot of words, a lot of explanations, none of which really mattered. Then he finally got to the point. The inspector mentioned a possible solution. Of course he did. I waited. A recorded easement. There it was. The real reason he was standing in front of me. He wanted legal access through my driveway. Permanent legal access. Attached to my property forever. I asked him what exactly that would mean. His answer sounded simple. I'd allow vehicles to cross part of my driveway, so the garage could remain exactly where it was. In exchange, he'd cover filing fees and paperwork costs. I almost admired the confidence. This man was asking for permanent rights affecting my property my future buyers, my insurance, my liability exposure. And his sales pitch was basically, don't worry, I'll pay the paperwork. I kept my expression neutral. I'll think about it. The truth? I already knew I wasn't going to do it, but I wanted to be fair. So over the next several days, I called a property attorney. Then another. I researched easements, liability, property values, future ownership disputes, everything. And the deeper I looked, the worse the idea became. An easement isn't temporary. It doesn't disappear because neighbors get along. It becomes attached to the land itself. Future owners inherit it. Future conflicts inherit it. Future headaches inherit it. And for what benefit? So Travis could avoid rebuilding a garage that should never have been built that way in the first place? The answer became pretty obvious. A week later, he showed up again. This time he looked hopeful, like a man waiting for good news. I took a breath. Then I told him respectfully that I wasn't interested in granting the easement. The change in his face was immediate. The friendliness vanished. The smile vanished. Everything vanished. And then he asked a question I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. So you're really going to make me rebuild this thing? There was something fascinating about the way he said it, as if I had somehow caused the problem, as if I had drawn the plans, as if I had poured the concrete, as if I had built the garage myself. I looked at him for a moment. Then I gave the only answer that felt honest. I didn't build it. His jaw tightened. For a second, I thought he might say something worse. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and walked away. That was the last real conversation we ever had, because from that point forward, the city gave him a deadline. And without an easement, there was only one remaining option. The garage had to be rebuilt. What happened next was something I'll never forget, because watching a man dismantle his own assumptions is sometimes even more expensive than building them in the first place. A few weeks later, the contractors came back, not to finish the garage, not to install the door, not to celebrate completion. They came back to tear it apart. The first morning I heard the sound of saws again, I looked out my kitchen window, expecting progress. Instead, I watched workers remove framing that had already been measured, cut, installed, inspected, and paid for. It felt surreal, like watching somebody reverse time. The garage opening disappeared first. Then entire sections of wall framing came down. Support beams were removed. Exterior materials were stripped away. Truck after truck arrived, carrying replacement lumber and new building materials. Every day, the project seemed to move backward before it could move forward again. One afternoon, I was working in my front yard when one of the contractors walked over for a quick break. He glanced toward the construction site and shook his head. Expensive mistake. That bad? I asked. He laughed. Worse than bad. Then he started listing everything involved. Engineering revisions, permit modifications, labor costs, material replacement, additional inspections, scheduling delays, subcontractors returning, crews redoing completed work. The list just kept going. Before he walked away, he gave me a rough estimate. Not an official number, just an educated guess. Let's just say it was enough money to buy a pretty nice vehicle. Maybe two. And the crazy part? Almost all of it could have been avoided by spending 20 minutes looking at a survey map before construction started. Every day, I watched pieces of that assumption get removed board by board, because that's what this really was. Not a construction failure, an assumption failure. Months earlier, somebody had convinced themselves my driveway would somehow become part of their solution. Maybe they thought I'd never notice. Maybe they assumed I'd eventually agree. Maybe they figured everything would be easier after the garage was already built. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that assumptions have a funny way of becoming facts inside people's heads, especially when money gets involved, especially when they've already committed to an outcome. The human mind does something strange once we've invested enough time and energy into a plan. We stop asking whether the plan makes sense. We start defending it. And that's exactly what seemed to happen here. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the garage began taking shape again. This time, the entrance faced the direction it should have faced from the beginning, toward Travis's own property, toward land he actually controlled, toward reality. Eventually, the red stop work notice disappeared. Final inspections were scheduled. The city signed off. The project was finally approved. And just like that, the neighborhood settled back into normal life. No more inspectors. No more contractors. No more awkward conversations. Just another garage sitting quietly behind another house. But every time I drove past it, I couldn't help thinking about everything that had happened. Not because of the building. Honestly, I couldn't care less about a garage. What fascinated me was the psychology behind it. The foundation wasn't concrete. The foundation was belief. Somewhere along the way, Travis had stopped treating access to my driveway as a possibility. He started treating it like a certainty. And once that happened, every decision that followed got stacked on top of that belief. The design, the construction, the money, the planning, everything. Then reality showed up with paperwork, and the entire thing collapsed. A few days after the final inspection, I happened to see the city inspector one last time. He was loading equipment into his truck. We exchanged a few words. Then he looked over at the rebuilt garage and smiled. You know, he said, people spend a lot of time planning buildings. I nodded. He continued, but they don't spend enough time figuring out where their rights begin and where they end. Then he climbed into his truck and drove away. And honestly, that might have been the smartest thing anybody said during the entire situation. Because in the end, the problem wasn't construction. It wasn't architecture. It wasn't permits. It wasn't even a garage. The problem was believing somebody else's property could quietly become part of your project without their permission. That's what started everything. And eventually reality caught up. Looking back now, years later, I don't think Travis was some evil mastermind trying to steal land. I think he wanted a bigger garage. He found a design he liked. He became emotionally attached to the outcome. And once that happened, he stopped questioning the premise. People do it every day, not just with property disputes, with businesses, relationships, investments, life decisions. We become so focused on where we want to go that we stop paying attention to whether the road actually exists. Then when reality pushes back, we feel cheated, as if the problem came out of nowhere. When in truth, the warning signs were there from the very beginning. The survey was there. The property lines were there. The paperwork was there. The facts never changed. Only the assumptions did. And if there's one lesson I took from the entire experience, it's this. Ownership isn't determined by what somebody hopes to use. Ownership is determined by what they actually have the legal right to use. Those are two very different things. In the end, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't celebrate. I didn't enjoy watching somebody spend a fortune correcting a mistake. All I felt was relief. Relief that the issue got resolved legally. Relief that it got resolved peacefully. And relief that it happened before an even bigger dispute developed years down the road. But here's the question I've always wondered about. If you were standing in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have granted the easement and let the garage stay exactly where it was? Would you have accepted the deal and tried to keep the peace? Or would you have protected your property rights, even if it meant your neighbor had to spend thousands rebuilding his project? Let me know down in the comments. Because whenever property rights, expensive mistakes, and stubborn assumptions collide, people usually have very strong opinions. And honestly, I'm curious which side you'd be on.